The blood soaked through her dress in a crimson stain that spread like spilled wine across pale fabric. And Marshal Finn knew with absolute certainty that if he didn't get Jane Morrison to shelter within the hour, both she and the baby she carried would die in this God-forsaken storm. He had been riding the boundary of his territory near Alta, Utah, checking fence lines for the cattle ranchers who paid him to keep their property secure, when he heard the woman's scream cut through the howling wind. March of 1884 had brought unseasonable weather to the mountain town, a late winter storm that turned the world into sheets of driving rain and sleet. Marshal had urged his horse toward the sound, his heart pounding with a dread he couldn't name, and found her crumpled against the side of an overturned wagon, her hands pressed to her swollen belly, her face twisted in agony. The wagon driver lay 10 feet away, his neck broken, clearly thrown when the horses had spooked. 2 men on horseback were disappearing into the gray curtain of rain, and Marshal caught only a glimpse of them before they vanished completely. But he saw enough, the way one man's boot was still raised, the cruel angle of it, and he understood what had happened. They had kicked her, kicked a pregnant woman, and left her to die in the storm. Marshal dismounted before his horse fully stopped, his boots hitting the muddy ground with a splash. He was at Jane's side in 3 long strides, his hands already moving to assess the damage. Her dark hair was plastered to her face, and her brown eyes were wide with fear and pain as they locked onto his. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the thunder that rolled across the sky. "My baby. Please help my baby." He had seen plenty of blood in his 26 years, had witnessed death in forms both quick and slow during his time as a lawman in these rough territories. But something about the desperation in this woman's eyes, the way her hands trembled as they clutched her belly, struck him in a place he hadn't known was vulnerable. "I've got you," Marshal said, his voice steady despite the chaos around them. "I'm going to get you somewhere safe." He needed to move her, but he also needed to be careful. The bleeding concerned him greatly, dark and steady, soaking through layers of clothing. He stripped off his heavy oilskin coat and wrapped it around her shoulders, then carefully, so carefully, he slid one arm beneath her knees and another behind her back. Jane cried out when he lifted her, a sound that tore through him like a knife. "I know," he murmured, holding her as gently as he could manage. "I know it hurts. Just hold on." She was lighter than he expected, or perhaps adrenaline made her seem so. He turned toward his horse, a sturdy bay gelding named Copper, who stood steady despite the storm. Getting into the saddle while holding her would be nearly impossible, but Marshal had learned long ago that impossible just meant difficult. He positioned Jane so she could wrap her arms around his neck, then used his free hand to grip the saddle horn. His muscles strained as he pulled himself up, using the stirrup for leverage while keeping Jane secure against his chest. It took 3 attempts, his boots slipping in the mud, but finally he was mounted with Jane cradled in his lap. "Where are you taking me?" Jane asked through chattering teeth. She was going into shock, he realized. The pale cast to her skin, the way her body had started to shake, these were signs he knew too well. "There's an old mining cabin about 2 miles north," Marshal said, guiding Copper with his knees since both arms were occupied holding Jane. "It's not much, but it'll keep us dry and out of this wind." The ride felt eternal. Every jostle made Jane whimper, and Marshal found himself talking to her constantly, anything to keep her conscious and focused. He told her about Copper, about how he had raised the horse from a foal. He told her about Alta, about the silver mines that had brought prosperity to the little town nestled in the Wasatch Mountains. He told her about the general store that sold the best peppermint sticks west of Salt Lake City. "What's your name?" Jane asked at one point, her voice so soft he almost missed it. "Marshal Finn," he replied, "but most folks just call me Marshal." "That's your actual name, not your title?" Despite everything, he found himself almost smiling. "My father had a sense of humor, figured if he named me Marshal, I'd grow into the role." "Did you?" "Became a deputy at 19, been wearing a badge ever since." Jane was quiet for a moment, then said, "I'm Jane Morrison. Pleased to meet you, Jane Morrison. Though I wish it were under better circumstances." She laughed, a weak sound that turned into a cough. "That makes 2 of us." The cabin appeared through the rain like a mirage, its rough-hewn log walls dark with moisture, but solid and real. Marshal guided Copper right up to the door, then carefully dismounted with Jane still in his arms. The door was unlocked, as he knew it would be. Mining cabins like this were left open as a courtesy, a place of refuge for anyone caught in bad weather or worse situations. Inside was dim and musty, but dry. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, and a rough wooden bed frame with a thin mattress stood in the corner. There was a table, 2 chairs, and shelves that held a few supplies, canned goods and blankets left by previous occupants. Marshal laid Jane on the bed as gently as he could, then immediately set about building a fire. His hands worked with practiced efficiency, arranging kindling and striking his flint until sparks caught and flames began to lick upward. The wood was dry, thank God, stored in a box beside the hearth for exactly this purpose. Once the fire was going, Marshal turned his full attention to Jane. She had curled onto her side, still holding her belly, and the blood had soaked through his coat now. He needed to examine her, needed to see how bad the damage was, but he also needed her permission. "Jane," he said, kneeling beside the bed so they were at eye level. "I need to check where you're hurt. I need to see if I can stop the bleeding." Her eyes met his, and he saw the fear there, but also trust. It humbled him, that trust. They had known each other less than an hour, and yet she was putting her life and her baby's life in his hands. "Do what you need to do," she whispered. Marshal had never delivered a baby, had never dealt with a pregnant woman's injuries beyond basic first aid. But he knew enough to understand that Jane was in serious danger. The kick had likely caused internal damage, and the bleeding suggested something had torn or ruptured. He found clean cloth in the supplies, likely left by miners who used the cabin during their shifts. He heated water over the fire in a battered pot, then returned to Jane's side. As carefully as he could, he helped her out of the soaked dress, leaving her in her chemise and petticoats. The blood was coming from low in her abdomen, and when he pressed gently around the area, Jane cried out. "I'm sorry," Marshal said, his jaw tight. "I'm so sorry." He cleaned the blood away as best he could, then pressed folded cloth against the worst of it, applying steady pressure. Jane's hand found his wrist, gripping it with surprising strength. "The baby," she said. "Can you feel the baby moving?" Marshal placed his free hand on her belly, which was hard and round beneath the thin fabric of her chemise. He waited, barely breathing, and then he felt it, a flutter of movement, small but unmistakable. "Yes," he said, and the relief in his voice was palpable. "I can feel movement." Jane started to cry then, tears streaming down her face as sobs shook her body. Marshal stayed beside her, one hand maintaining pressure on the wound, the other resting on her belly as if he could protect the life inside through sheer force of will. "I thought I lost them," Jane said between sobs. "When those men kicked me, when I felt the blood, I thought my baby was gone." "Who were they?" Marshal asked, his voice harder than he intended. "Who did this to you?" Jane's expression shifted, fear replacing some of the relief. "I don't know their names. They stopped our wagon on the road, said they wanted whatever money we were carrying. Samuel, the driver, he tried to fight them off. One of them shot him, and when I screamed, when I tried to run, they just laughed. One of them kicked me right in the stomach, said I wasn't worth robbing anyway." Rage flowed through Marshal like liquid fire. He had dealt with outlaws and bandits throughout his career, had seen cruelty in many forms, but there was something particularly vile about men who would attack a pregnant woman. "They'll answer for this," he said quietly. "I promise you that." "I just want to live," Jane whispered. "I just want my baby to live." The bleeding slowed over the next hour, though it didn't stop completely. Marshal changed the cloths regularly, keeping everything as clean as possible. He made Jane drink water, made her eat a few bites of hardtack, even though she protested she wasn't hungry. She needed strength, needed to keep her body functioning for the sake of the child she carried. As night fell and the storm continued to rage outside, Marshal found himself learning Jane's story in bits and pieces. She was 22 years old, originally from St. Louis. She had come to Utah with her husband 3 years ago, drawn by promises of work in the silver mines and a fresh start. "James was a good man," Jane said, staring at the ceiling as she spoke. "He worked hard, never complained. But the mines, they're dangerous. A tunnel collapsed last October. He didn't survive." "I'm sorry," Marshal said, and he meant it. Jane turned her head to look at him. "I found out I was pregnant 2 weeks after he died. Part of me was devastated because I knew I'd be raising this baby alone. But Part of me was grateful because it meant I still had a piece of him. You were traveling alone today? I was heading to Salt Lake City. My sister lives there with her husband. She sent word that I could stay with them until after the baby comes, help them with their farm in exchange for room and board. Jane's voice broke. Samuel was a friend of James's from the mine. He offered to drive me since he was heading that direction anyway. Now he's dead because he tried to protect me. Marshal stood and moved to the window, looking out at the darkness beyond. The rain was still falling, heavy and relentless. They wouldn't be leaving this cabin tonight, possibly not tomorrow either, depending on how the weather played out and how Jane fared. You should rest, he said, turning back to her. I'll keep the fire going and keep watch. I can't ask you to do that. You've already done so much. You're not asking, I'm offering. Marshal pulled one of the chairs closer to the bed and sat down. Besides, I'm a lawman. Protecting people is what I do. Jane studied him for a long moment, her brown eyes searching his face as if trying to memorize his features. Why did you help me? Most men would have ridden past, not wanting to get involved. The question caught Marshal off guard. He thought about it, really thought about it, before answering. My mother died when I was 12, he said finally. She was sick, had been for months, and my father and I did everything we could to help her. But in the end, it wasn't enough. After she passed, my father told me something I've never forgotten. He said the measure of a man isn't in how much money he makes or how many cattle he owns. It's in what he does when someone needs help and no one else is watching. Your father sounds like a wise man. He was, passed himself about 5 years back. Marshal leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. When I heard you scream today, when I saw you lying there bleeding, I didn't even think about it. I just knew I had to help. Jane reached out, and Marshal took her hand without hesitation. Her fingers were cold despite the fire, and he wrapped both his hands around hers, trying to warm them. Thank you, she said simply, for saving our lives. You're not out of danger yet, Marshal warned. That bleeding could start again, or you could develop a fever. And the baby. I know, Jane interrupted. I know we're not safe yet, but at least we have a chance now. Before you came, we had nothing. Sleep claimed Jane eventually, her exhausted body demanding rest. Marshal kept vigil through the night, feeding the fire and checking on her regularly. The bleeding had slowed to little more than spotting, which he took as a good sign. Her color was better too, though she was still pale. He found himself watching her sleep, noting the curve of her cheek, the way her dark hair fanned across the pillow. Even battered and bruised, even carrying another man's child, she was beautiful. The thought surprised him. Marshal hadn't allowed himself to think about women much over the past few years. His work kept him busy, and the few relationships he had attempted never seemed to go anywhere. Women wanted stability, wanted a man who came home every night. Being a lawman meant danger was always just around the corner, and most women weren't willing to live with that uncertainty. But as he sat there in the firelight, listening to the storm outside and the soft sound of Jane's breathing, Marshal felt something shift inside him. It was too early to call it anything specific, too presumptuous to even put a name to it, but he knew with absolute certainty that Jane Morrison had changed something in him, had awakened something he thought he had buried long ago. Morning came slowly, the darkness gradually giving way to a gray dawn. The rain had lessened to a steady drizzle, and the wind had died down considerably. Marshal stepped outside to check on Copper, who he had secured in a lean-to beside the cabin. The horse was fine, if a bit damp and annoyed at the accommodations. When Marshal returned inside, he found Jane awake, struggling to sit up. Easy, he said, moving quickly to her side. Don't push yourself too hard. I need to use the necessary, Jane said, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment. There was an outhouse behind the cabin, but Marshal wasn't sure Jane was strong enough to walk that far. He found a chamber pot in the supplies, discreetly placed it within reach, then stepped outside to give her privacy. The morning air was cold and clean, washed fresh by the storm. Marshal breathed deeply, trying to clear his head. He needed to get Jane to a doctor as soon as possible. Needed to make sure both she and the baby were truly out of danger. But Alta was still a good ride away, and he wasn't sure she was strong enough for the journey yet. When Jane called out that she was finished, Marshal returned inside. She looked better in the daylight, he decided. There was color in her cheeks now, and her eyes were clearer. How do you feel? He asked. Sore, tired. but better than yesterday. Jane looked down at her hands, which were folded in her lap. The bleeding has almost stopped. I can barely feel it now. That's good, very good. Marshal busied himself with making breakfast, heating canned beans over the fire, and making coffee in the pot. It wasn't much, but it was warm and filling. They ate in comfortable silence, and Marshal found himself hyper-aware of every small detail. The way Jane held her cup with both hands, savoring the warmth. The way she ate slowly, carefully, as if testing her body's response to food. The way she kept one hand on her belly, a protective gesture that was probably unconscious. "Tell me about Alta," Jane said after they finished eating. "What's it like?" Marshal settled back in his chair, considering his answer. "It's a mining town mostly. Silver brought people here about 10 years ago, and they've been pulling ore out of these mountains ever since. Population is maybe 800 people, give or take. We've got a main street with all the usual businesses, general store, saloon, hotel, church. Doctor's office, too, run by Doc Henderson. He's getting on in years, but he's good at what he does. Do you have family there?" "Not anymore. My father was the sheriff before me. After he died, the town council asked me to take over. I've been doing it ever since." "Is it lonely?" Jane asked, "being the law in a place like that?" The question was more perceptive than Marshal expected. "Sometimes," he admitted. "People respect the badge, but they also keep their distance. Hard to make real friends when your job is to arrest people when they step out of line." "I imagine it is." Jane shifted on the bed, wincing slightly. "I felt that way after James died. People were kind, brought food, and offered condolences. But there was always this distance, like they didn't know what to say or how to act around the grieving widow." "Grief makes people uncomfortable," Marshal observed. "It reminds them of their own mortality, their own losses." "Yes, exactly." Jane looked at him with something like surprise. "You understand that." "I've seen enough death to understand a lot of things I wish I didn't." They talked through the morning, sharing stories and experiences as the cabin warmed and the storm outside continued to fade. Marshall learned that Jane loved to read, that she had taught herself piano as a child, that her favorite color was green, like the forest back in Missouri. Jane learned that Marshall could track almost any animal through any terrain, that he had once talked down a bank robber without firing a single shot, that he had a weakness for apple pie. The conversation flowed easily, naturally, as if they had known each other for years instead of hours. Marshall found himself laughing at Jane's dry observations about life in the mining camps, found himself sharing stories he rarely told anyone. There was something about her, something that made him want to open up in ways he usually kept locked tight. By afternoon, Marshall decided Jane was strong enough to attempt the ride back to Alta. The bleeding had stopped completely, and while she was still sore and weak, she could move without the sharp pain that had characterized her condition the day before. "We'll take it slow," Marshall promised as he helped her into her now dry dress. He had hung it by the fire overnight, and while it was stained beyond repair, it was at least warm and clean. "If you need to stop, you tell me immediately." "I will," Jane promised. Getting her onto copper was easier than getting her off had been. Marshall mounted first, then pulled Jane up to sit in front of him, her back against his chest. He wrapped one arm around her waist, careful to avoid her injured belly, and took the reins with his other hand. The ride to Alta took nearly 3 hours. Marshall kept Copper at a slow, steady walk, avoiding anything that might jostle Jane unnecessarily. She leaned back against him, and he could feel her breathing, could feel the way her body relaxed into his as the miles passed. "Tell me more about the doctor," Jane said at one point. "Doc Henderson. Will he be able to help me?" "He delivered half the babies in this town," Marshall assured her. "If anyone can make sure you and your little one are healthy, it's him." "Good, that's good." Jane paused, then asked, "What happens after the doctor checks me out?" It was a fair question, and Marshall had been thinking about it himself. "The hotel in town is decent. I can get you a room there while you recover. Then, when you're strong enough, I can arrange transportation to Salt Lake City, if that's still where you want to go." "That's very kind of you." Jane's voice was quiet. "You've been so kind." "It's the least I can do." Alta came into view as the sun began its descent toward the western peaks. The town was nestled in a valley, surrounded by mountains that still held snow on their highest points, despite the arrival of spring. Smoke rose from dozens of chimneys, and Marshall could see people moving along the main street, going about their daily business. He guided Copper straight to the doctor's office, a neat building, with a sign hanging above the door. Doc Henderson was inside, organizing supplies on shelves, when Marshall pushed through the door with Jane in his arms. "Marshall, what in the name of—" Doc Henderson trailed off as he took in the scene. He was a man in his 60s with white hair and sharp blue eyes that missed nothing. "Bring her back here, quickly." Marshall carried Jane to the examination room and laid her on the table as gently as he had laid her on the bed in the mining cabin. Doc Henderson was already rolling up his sleeves, his face serious as he began his assessment. "What happened?" the doctor asked as he worked. Marshall explained, keeping his voice level despite the anger that still simmered beneath the surface. Doc Henderson listened while examining Jane, his hands gentle but thorough. He paid special attention to her abdomen, pressing carefully in various places and asking Jane to describe what she felt. "The baby's heartbeat is strong," Doc Henderson announced after several minutes. He had placed a special horn-shaped instrument against Jane's belly, listening intently. "And from what I can tell, there's no serious internal damage. You were very lucky, young lady." Jane started crying again, tears of relief this time. "Thank you, God. Thank you. You'll need to rest for at least a week, probably 2, Doc Henderson continued. "No heavy lifting, no strenuous activity. The bleeding has stopped, which is excellent, but it could start again if you overexert yourself. You're about 6 months along, would you say?" 6.5, Jane confirmed. "Good. The baby's positioned well, everything seems normal. But given what you've been through, I want to monitor you closely over the next few weeks." Doc Henderson turned to Marshall. "She needs somewhere to stay, somewhere quiet and safe." "I was going to get her a room at the hotel," Marshall said. "That'll work, but someone needs to check on her regularly, make sure she's eating, make sure there are no complications." "I can do that," Marshall heard himself saying. "I'll make sure she's looked after." Doc Henderson gave him a long, measuring look, then nodded. "I'm sure you will." The doctor provided Jane with some herbs to help with pain and instructions for care. Then Marshall carried her to the hotel. The proprietor, a woman named Mrs. Ellis, who had known Marshall since he was a boy, took one look at Jane and immediately began fussing. "Oh, you poor dear. Let's get you upstairs and into bed right away. Marshall, you bring her up to room 3. It's the quietest room, facing away from the street." Room 3 was small but clean, with a comfortable-looking bed covered in a patchwork quilt. There was a washstand with a pitcher and basin, a dresser, and a chair by the window that looked out over the mountains. Marshall laid Jane on the bed for the 3rd time that day, and she gave him a tired smile. "You keep having to carry me places," she said. "I promise I can usually walk on my own." "I don't mind," Marshall replied, and he realized it was true. He didn't mind at all. Mrs. Ellis shooed him out so she could help Jane into a clean nightgown and get her properly settled. Marshall waited in the hallway, suddenly unsure of what to do with himself. He had been focused on getting Jane to safety, on making sure she received medical care. Now that was accomplished, he felt oddly at loose ends. When Mrs. Ellis emerged, she gave Marshall a knowing look. "She's asking for you," the older woman said. "Said she wants to say thank you properly." Marshall entered the room to find Jane tucked under the quilt, her dark hair spread across the white pillowcase. She looked small and vulnerable, and something in his chest tightened. "The doctor said you saved my life," Jane said. "Said if I had been out in that storm much longer, I would have died from blood loss or exposure or both. I did what anyone would have done." "No," Jane shook her head. "Most people would have ridden past, wouldn't have wanted to get involved. But you stopped, and you helped, and you stayed with me through the night." Her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "I don't know how to thank you for that." Marshall moved closer to the bed, his hat in his hands. "You don't need to thank me. Just focus on getting better, on taking care of that baby." "I will, I promise." Jane reached out her hand, and Marshall took it without thinking. "Will you come back to check on me?" "Every day," Marshall promised. "Doc Henderson said someone needs to make sure you're following his orders. Might as well be me." Jane smiled, and it transformed her face, chasing away the lingering shadows of the pain and fear. "I'd like that." Marshall left the hotel as evening settled over Alta, his mind churning. He needed to report what had happened, needed to start tracking the men who had attacked Jane. But as he walked toward his office, he found his thoughts kept returning to the woman in room 3, to the feeling of her hand in his, to the way she had smiled. He had known her less than a day. It was absurd to feel this way, absurd to feel anything beyond professional concern. And yet, Marshall couldn't deny what was happening. Jane Morrison had gotten under his skin in a way no woman ever had, and he suspected his life would never quite be the same because of it. The next 2 weeks fell into a routine. Marshall visited Jane every morning before starting his rounds, and every evening before heading home. He brought her meals from the hotel dining room, made sure she was comfortable, and sat with her for hours, talking about everything and nothing. Jane grew stronger each day. The color returned to her cheeks, the dark circles under her eyes faded, and her movements became easier, more natural. Her belly seemed to grow larger daily, and she often placed Marshall's hand on it so he could feel the baby kick. "He's strong," Jane said one afternoon, her hand covering Marshall's as the baby moved beneath their palms. Or she. Either way, this child has a fighter's spirit. "Takes after the mother," Marshall observed, and Jane blushed. They had grown comfortable with each other, Marshall realized. The formality of those first interactions had given way to an easy camaraderie. Jane teased him about his serious demeanor, and Marshall found himself making her laugh with stories from his work. She told him about her dreams for the future, about wanting to give her child a good life full of opportunities. He shared his own hopes, his desire to make Alta a safer place, a better place. "Do you ever think about leaving?" Jane asked one evening. They were sitting by the window, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and pink. "Going somewhere bigger, somewhere with more opportunity?" Marshall considered the question. "Sometimes," he admitted, "there's a whole world out there beyond these mountains. But Alta is home. These people depend on me, and I don't take that responsibility lightly." "You're a good man, Marshal Finn," Jane said softly. "Your father would be proud of you." The words hit Marshall harder than he expected. He had spent years trying to live up to his father's legacy, trying to be the kind of lawman the old man had been. Hearing Jane say it, hearing her confirm that he had succeeded, meant more than he could express. "I hope so," he said finally. As the days passed, Marshall became increasingly aware of his feelings for Jane. It wasn't just concern anymore, wasn't just the protective instinct that had driven him to help her in the first place. He looked forward to seeing her each day, found excuses to extend his visits. He noticed small things, the way she tucked her hair behind her ear when she was thinking, the way she hummed softly when she thought no one was listening, the way her whole face lit up when she laughed. He was falling in love with her. It was both the most wonderful and most terrifying realization of his life. The problem was Jane's situation. She was pregnant with another man's child, still grieving her husband, and planning to leave Alta as soon as she was strong enough. Marshall had no right to complicate things with his feelings, no right to burden her with emotions she might not share or want. So he kept quiet, content to simply be near her, to be part of her life in whatever capacity she would allow. Jane, for her part, seemed to enjoy his company. She asked about his day, listened intently to his stories, and shared her own thoughts and feelings with increasing openness. But Marshall couldn't read her beyond that. Did she see him as simply a friend, a protector? Or did she feel something deeper, something that matched the emotions growing in his own chest? 3 weeks after the attack, Jane was finally cleared by Doc Henderson to resume normal activities. The baby was healthy, Jane's injuries had healed completely, and there were no signs of complications. "You've made a remarkable recovery," Doc Henderson told her during her examination. "But I want you to be careful. You're in your 3rd trimester now, and that baby could come any time in the next 10 to 12 weeks. No travel, no stress. You understand?" "I understand," Jane said, though Marshall could see the worry in her eyes. After they left the doctor's office, Marshall walked Jane back to the hotel. It was a beautiful spring day, the air warm and fragrant with the scent of wildflowers blooming in the meadows beyond town. "What's wrong?" Marshall asked. He had learned to read Jane's moods, could tell when something was bothering her. Jane was quiet for a long moment, then said, "I can't travel to Salt Lake City, not until after the baby is born. But I can't afford to stay at the hotel that long either. Mrs. Ellis has been kind about extending credit, but I've already run up quite a bill." Marshall had known this was coming, had been thinking about it himself. "You could stay with me," he said, trying to keep his voice casual. "I've got a house on the edge of town. It's small, just 2 bedrooms, but there's plenty of space. You could have your own room, your privacy." Jane stopped walking and turned to face him. Marshall, I can't ask you to do that. You're not asking, I'm offering. He met her eyes steadily. You need a place to stay, and I have one. It's that simple. It's not simple at all, Jane said, but her voice was gentle. People will talk. A single woman living in an unmarried man's house, in a town this small? Let them talk. I don't care what people think. But I do. Jane placed her hand on his arm. You have a reputation to maintain, a position in this community. I won't be the reason people start questioning your integrity. Marshall felt frustration rise in his chest. My integrity isn't dependent on what gossips say. It's dependent on doing the right thing, and the right thing is making sure you and that baby have a safe place to stay. They stood there on the boardwalk, facing each other, and something shifted between them. Marshall saw it in Jane's eyes, a softening, a realization. Why are you doing this? Jane asked quietly. Why are you going so far out of your way to help me? Because I love you, Marshall thought. Because the idea of you leaving tears me apart. Because I want to be there when your baby is born, want to help you raise that child, want to build a life with you. But he couldn't say any of that. It was too much, too soon, too complicated. Because you need help, he said instead. And because I want to. Jane studied his face for a long moment, and Marshall had the distinct feeling she was seeing right through him, seeing all the words he hadn't said. Then she nodded slowly. All right, she said, but only until the baby is born and I'm strong enough to travel, and I insist on helping around the house, cooking and cleaning. I won't be a burden. You could never be a burden, Marshall said, and he meant it with his whole heart. Moving Jane into his house created exactly the stir she had predicted. Marshall could feel the eyes on them as he carried her bags down the street, could hear the whispers that followed. Mrs. Ellis had pursed her lips in disapproval, though she said nothing directly. Other townspeople were less subtle. That's not proper, Marshall, Mr. Thompson from the general store said when Marshall stopped in for supplies. A woman in your condition, living with an unmarried man. Mrs. Morrison needs a place to stay, and I have the space, Marshall replied evenly. There's nothing improper about it. But he understood the concern, even if he disagreed with it. In 1884, social conventions were strict, especially in small towns where everyone knew everyone else's business. A single woman living with a single man, pregnant or not, was scandalous. Jane felt the censure even more acutely. When she ventured into town to do shopping, women who had been friendly before now crossed the street to avoid her. Men tipped their hats but didn't stop to chat. The pastor's wife actually sniffed in disapproval when Jane passed her on the boardwalk. I told you people would talk, Jane said one evening. She was cooking dinner, moving around Marshall's small kitchen with easy competence. I told you this would cause problems. It'll blow over, Marshall said, though he wasn't entirely sure he believed it. People always find something new to gossip about eventually. But as the weeks passed, the talk didn't die down. If anything, it intensified. Marshall found himself defending his decision to anyone who would listen, explaining that Jane was simply a friend in need, that his intentions were entirely honorable. The truth was more complicated. Living with Jane, seeing her every morning at breakfast and every evening at dinner, had only deepened Marshall's feelings. He loved the way she hummed while cooking, loved finding her books scattered around his usually sparse living room, loved the sound of her laughter filling the house. And he was fairly certain, though he didn't dare hope too much, that Jane might be developing feelings for him too. He caught her watching him sometimes, her expression soft and thoughtful. She found excuses to touch his arm when they talked, and she smiled whenever he entered a room. Small things, perhaps, but they made Marshall's heart race nonetheless. One evening, in late April, about 5 weeks after Jane had moved in, they were sitting on the porch watching the sunset. It had become their routine, this quiet time together at the end of the day. Jane was 8 months pregnant now, her belly so large she had trouble getting comfortable in any position. Tell me about James, Marshall said suddenly. He had been wanting to ask for weeks, but hadn't known how to bring it up. What was he like? Jane looked surprised by the question, but not upset. He was kind, she said slowly. Patient. He loved working with his hands, building things. He made me a rocking chair for our first anniversary, carved flowers into the wood. I had to leave it behind when I left for Salt Lake City. Too big to bring with me. Do you miss him? Every day. Jane's hand moved to her belly, the gesture automatic now. But the grief isn't as sharp as it was. Time doesn't heal all wounds. but it does soften them. I'll always love James, always be grateful for the time we had together, but I also know he would want me to move forward, to find happiness again. She turned to look at Marshall, and her eyes were clear and direct. What about you? Have you ever been in love? Once, Marshall admitted. A long time ago. Her name was Sarah. We talked about getting married, but she didn't want to be married to a lawman. Too dangerous, she said, too uncertain. She married a banker instead, moved to Denver. Do you regret it? Marshall thought about it, really thought about it. I regret that it didn't work out. But I don't regret my choice to keep this job, to stay in Alta. This is where I'm meant to be. If Sarah couldn't accept that, then we weren't meant to be together. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, and then Jane said, People are still talking about us, you know. Mrs. Ellis told me yesterday that the ladies' church auxiliary is scandalized. I know. It bothers you more than you let on. Marshall sighed. It bothers me that it affects you, that it makes things harder for you. There is a solution, Jane said carefully. A way to make the talk stop. Marshall's heart started pounding. What do you mean? Jane met his eyes steadily. We could get married. It would be a practical arrangement, something to protect both our reputations. After the baby is born, after I'm strong enough, we could get it annulled if you wanted, but at least for now, it would solve the problem. A practical arrangement. The words hit Marshall like a punch to the gut. Jane was offering marriage, but only as a social convenience, a way to quiet the gossips. Not because she loved him, not because she wanted to build a life with him. He should have said no, should have told her that marriage was too important to enter into for the wrong reasons. But looking at her in the fading light, seeing the hope and uncertainty in her eyes, Marshall found himself saying, All right, if that's what you want, we'll get married. The wedding took place 3 days later in the church on Main Street. It was a small affair, just the pastor and his wife as witnesses, with Doc Henderson in attendance as well. Jane wore a simple dress in pale blue that accommodated her pregnant belly, and Marshall wore his Sunday suit with his badge polished to a shine. The ceremony was brief, perfunctory. Marshall repeated the vows, heard Jane do the same, and then the pastor was pronouncing them man and wife. You may kiss the bride, he said with a smile. Marshall leaned down and pressed a chaste kiss to Jane's lips. It was barely more than a brush of contact, but it sent electricity racing through his entire body. When he pulled back, he saw that Jane's cheeks were flushed, her eyes wide. Congratulations, Doc Henderson said, shaking Marshall's hand. I hope you'll both be very happy together. Thank you, Marshall managed. They walked back to the house, to their house, in silence. The sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. Under other circumstances, it would have been romantic, but the weight of what they had done, of the lies they would now be living, hung heavy between them. Inside, Jane turned to face Marshall. Thank you, she said, for doing this. I know it's not what either of us wanted, but it does make things easier. Not what either of us wanted. The words stung, even though Marshall knew they shouldn't. This had been Jane's idea, her solution. He had simply agreed to it. You should rest, Marshall said, needing distance, needing space to process everything. It's been a long day. Jane nodded and headed to her room, the room that was technically now the marital bedroom, though neither of them had discussed that particular detail. Marshall waited until he heard her door close, then sank into a chair and put his head in his hands. He had married the woman he loved, but only as a charade, only to protect her reputation and quiet the gossip. She had made it clear this was temporary, something that could be undone once it was no longer necessary. He should have said no, should have found another solution, but it was too late now. They were married, bound together by law if not by love, and Marshall would have to figure out how to live with that. The next few weeks were awkward. Jane and Marshall danced around each other in the house, both hyper-aware of the change in their relationship. They were legally married now, but they still maintained separate bedrooms, still treated each other with a careful politeness that felt wrong after the easy camaraderie they had shared before. The gossip did indeed quiet down. Being a married woman, even one married under unusual circumstances, gave Jane a respectability she hadn't had before. The ladies of the town began nodding to her again on the street. Mrs. Ellis actually apologized for her earlier coldness. I should have known Marshall would do the honorable thing, the hotel proprietor said, marrying you proper so that baby would have a father. That's the kind of man he is." Jane smiled and thanked her, but inside she felt hollow. The honorable thing. That's all this marriage was to Marshall, she thought. An obligation, a duty. He had agreed to marry her because it was the right thing to do, not because he wanted to, and that hurt more than Jane wanted to admit. Because somewhere between that terrifying day in the storm and standing at the altar saying vows, Jane had fallen in love with Marshal Finn. She loved his quiet strength, his dry sense of humor, the way he was so gentle despite his size and his dangerous profession. She loved how he read to her in the evenings, how he made sure she ate properly, how he talked to her belly as if he could communicate with the baby inside. She had fallen in love with him, and she had trapped him in a marriage of convenience. The guilt was eating her alive. Late in May, when Jane was just days from her due date, everything came to a head. Jane had been particularly quiet all day, and when Marshall came home from his rounds, he found her sitting in the rocking chair he had bought for her, crying. "Jane?" He was at her side in an instant, kneeling beside the chair. "What's wrong? Is it the baby? Should I get Doc Henderson?" "No," Jane said, wiping at her tears. "The baby's fine. Everything's fine." "Then why are you crying?" Jane took a shaky breath. "Because I ruined your life. Because I forced you into a marriage you didn't want. Because you've done nothing but help me since the day we met, and I've repaid you by trapping you." Marshall stared at her. "Trapping me? Jane, what are you talking about?" "This marriage. You only agreed to it to protect me, to quiet the gossip. But now you're stuck with me, stuck with another man's child, and you're too honorable to say you regret it." "I don't regret it. You should. You deserve a real marriage, a real wife, someone who loves you." Jane's voice broke. "Not someone who manipulated you into a practical arrangement?" Marshall reached up and gently wiped a tear from her cheek. "Jane, look at me." She did, her brown eyes swimming with tears. "I married you because I wanted to," Marshall said, his voice steady and sure. "Not because it was the honorable thing to do, not because I felt obligated. I married you because I couldn't imagine my life without you in it." Jane's breath caught. "What?" "I love you," Marshall said simply. "I've been in love with you since the day I carried you through that storm. Maybe even before that, from the first moment I saw you. I know it's too soon. I know you're still grieving James. I know this baby isn't mine, but none of that changes how I feel. You love me?" Jane's voice was barely a whisper. "With everything I am." Jane started crying harder, but this time she was smiling too. "I love you too. God help me, Marshall. I love you so much it terrifies me. I didn't know how to tell you, didn't think you felt the same way. That's why I suggested the practical arrangement, because I thought it was the only way I could keep you in my life." Marshall felt like he could breathe for the first time in weeks. "You love me?" "Yes, you stubborn, wonderful man. I love you." He stood and pulled her up as gently as he could, mindful of her pregnant belly. Then he kissed her, really kissed her, pouring all the love and longing he had been holding back into that contact. Jane kissed him back with equal fervor, her arms coming up to wrap around his neck. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Marshall rested his forehead against hers. "This changes things," he said. "Yes," Jane agreed. "Everything changes. I want a real marriage with you, Jane. I want to be a father to this baby, want to raise this child as my own. I want to build a life with you, a family." "I want that too," Jane said, more than anything. They stood there in the fading light, holding each other, and Marshall felt a peace settle over him that he had never experienced before. This was right. This was what he had been searching for his whole life without knowing it. "We should probably discuss sleeping arrangements," Jane said after a moment, a teasing note in her voice. "Now that we've established this is a real marriage." Marshall laughed. "We should probably wait until after the baby is born. Don't want to jostle anything important." Probably wise. But that night, Jane moved into Marshall's room, into their room. They lay together in the darkness, Jane's back against Marshall's chest, his hand resting on her belly as the baby kicked and rolled. "What should we name the baby?" Jane asked softly. "That's your decision," Marshall said. "This is James's child." "No." Jane covered his hand with hers. "This is our child, mine and yours. You're going to be this baby's father in every way that matters, so we choose the name together." Marshall felt emotion tighten his throat. Together, he agreed. If it's a boy, I'd like to name him after my father. Matthew? Matthew Finn, Marshall said, trying it out. I like it. And if it's a girl, maybe something that honors your mother? Her name was Rose. Rose, Jane repeated. Rose Finn. That's beautiful. They fell asleep like that, wrapped around each other, planning for a future that felt bright and full of possibility. 3 days later, Jane went into labor. Marshall was out on patrol when it started, and by the time someone tracked him down and told him to get home immediately, Jane was already well into the process. He burst through the door to find Doc Henderson in the bedroom with Jane, along with Mrs. Ellis, who was acting as midwife. Jane was on the bed, her face flushed and sweaty, her hands gripping the sheets. "Marshall," she gasped when she saw him. "You're here. I'm here." He was at her side immediately, taking her hand. "I'm not going anywhere." The labor lasted another 6 hours. Marshall stayed with Jane the entire time, letting her squeeze his hand hard enough to bruise, wiping her face with cool cloths, murmuring encouragement and love. He had seen many difficult things in his life, but watching Jane in pain, unable to do anything to help her, was one of the hardest. But finally, as the sun was setting on a beautiful spring evening, a baby's cry filled the room. Doc Henderson held up a squirming, red-faced infant and announced, "It's a boy. Congratulations." Jane started crying immediately, reaching for the baby with trembling hands. Doc Henderson placed the infant on her chest, and Marshall watched as his wife, his beautiful, strong wife, gazed down at her newborn son with a love so fierce it took his breath away. "Matthew," Jane whispered. "Hello, Matthew. We've been waiting for you." The baby was perfect, tiny, and wrinkled with a shock of dark hair and powerful lungs. Marshall touched one miniature hand with a gentle finger, and Matthew immediately grabbed hold, his grip surprisingly strong. "Hello, son," Marshall said, his voice rough with emotion. "Welcome to the family." Doc Henderson and Mrs. Ellis cleaned up and left, giving the new family privacy. Marshall sat on the edge of the bed, his arm around Jane as she nursed Matthew for the first time. The baby latched on immediately, settling into a contented rhythm. "He's perfect," Jane said, not taking her eyes off Matthew. "Absolutely perfect." "He is," Marshall agreed. "Just like his mother." Jane looked up at him, her eyes soft. "His father isn't so bad either." They had agreed that Matthew would carry both legacies. His full name would be Matthew James Finn, honoring both the man who had given him life and the man who would raise him. It felt right, felt like a bridge between past and present. The first few weeks with a newborn were exhausting. Matthew had his days and nights confused, sleeping peacefully during daylight hours and waking every 2 hours after dark. Jane was tired but glowing, devoted to the baby in a way that was beautiful to watch. Marshall helped as much as he could, walking Matthew around the house at 3 a.m, changing diapers, learning to swaddle properly. "You're a natural at this," Jane observed one evening, watching Marshall rock Matthew to sleep. "I'm terrified I'm going to break him," Marshall admitted. "He's so small. He's tougher than he looks, takes after his father." The words made Marshall's heart swell every time. His father, not Matthew's biological father, but his real father in all the ways that mattered. As Matthew grew and the household settled into a routine, Marshall and Jane's relationship deepened as well. They were truly married now in every sense, partners in raising their son and building their life together. The awkwardness of those early weeks after the wedding had vanished, replaced by a comfortable intimacy that felt as natural as breathing. One day in August, when Matthew was 3 months old and starting to smile at everything, Marshall came home to find Jane in the garden behind the house. She had planted vegetables and flowers, transforming the bare earth into something beautiful and productive. "I've been thinking," Jane said, as Marshall joined her. "I never did make it to my sister's place in Salt Lake City." Marshall felt his stomach drop. "Do you want to go? I can arrange time off. We can all travel there together." "No." Jane turned to face him, a smile playing at her lips. "I meant that I've been thinking about writing to her, telling her I won't be coming after all, that I found a home here in Alta." Relief flooded through Marshall. "You want to stay?" "Of course I want to stay. This is where you are, where we built our life together." Jane stepped closer and wrapped her arms around his waist. "Alta is home now. You made it home." Marshall kissed her deeply, pouring all his love and gratitude into the contact. "I love you," he said when they finally broke apart. "I love you and Matthew more than I can express." "We love you too," Jane replied. "So much." That autumn, Marshall officially adopted Matthew. It was a simple process, just paperwork filed with the territorial government, but it felt monumental. Matthew James Finn was legally his son now, bound to him by more than just love. They celebrated that evening with a special dinner, just the three of them. Matthew was old enough now to sit in a high chair, banging his spoon and laughing at everything. Marshall and Jane kept catching each other's eyes across the table, smiling at the sheer perfection of the moment. "Thank you," Jane said as they were cleaning up after dinner. Matthew had fallen asleep in his cradle, worn out from all the excitement. "For everything you've done for us, for saving my life, for giving us a home, for loving Matthew as your own." "He is my own," Marshall said firmly. "There's no as if about it. That's my son sleeping in there." "I know," Jane kissed him softly. "You're an amazing father and an amazing husband." "I try." "You succeed." The years that followed were filled with the normal joys and challenges of family life. Matthew grew into a rambunctious toddler who seemed to have an endless supply of energy. He looked like James, with dark hair and brown eyes, but his mannerisms were all Marshall's. The way he walked with purpose even at 2 years old, the way he observed everything around him with serious attention, these were traits he had learned from the man he called Papa. When Matthew was 3, Jane discovered she was pregnant again. The news filled their small house with excitement and anticipation. Marshall was thrilled at the idea of another child, of watching Jane's belly grow with a baby he had helped create. "Are you hoping for a boy or a girl?" Jane asked one evening. She was just starting to show, a small bump that Marshall loved to rest his hand on. "I don't care either way," Marshall said honestly. "As long as you and the baby are healthy, I'll be happy with whatever we get." Such a diplomatic answer. "It's the truth." He pulled her close, mindful of her stomach. "Though a girl would be nice. A little version of you." Jane blushed. "A boy would be wonderful too. Matthew would love a little brother. He would love a little sister just as much." As it turned out, they got a girl. She was born on a snowy December day in 1886, coming into the world with a lusty cry that announced her presence to everyone within earshot. They named her Rose Ellen Finn, honoring both Marshall's mother and Jane's. Matthew was immediately smitten with his baby sister. At 3 years old, he appointed himself her protector, standing guard by her cradle and fetching anything his mama needed for the baby. Marshall watched his son's devotion with pride, knowing that Matthew had learned such behavior from watching the way Marshall cared for Jane. Rose was different from Matthew in almost every way. Where he had been serious and observant, she was joyful and outgoing. She smiled constantly, laughed at everything, and seemed to find delight in the simplest things. She had Jane's dark hair but Marshall's blue eyes, and he often found himself just staring at her, amazed that something so perfect could exist. "You're doing it again," Jane said one evening, finding Marshall standing by Rose's cradle, just watching the baby sleep. "Doing what?" "Looking at her like she hung the moon." Marshall grinned, unashamed. "She did. Both of them did." He gestured to where Matthew was sleeping in his bed across the room. "How did I get so lucky?" "We both got lucky," Jane corrected, coming to stand beside him. She leaned her head on his shoulder, and they stood together in comfortable silence, watching their children sleep. Life in Alta continued to be good. Marshall's reputation as a fair but firm lawman was well established. Crime in the town was relatively low, mostly drunk minors causing problems on payday or the occasional theft. The most excitement they had was when a gang of bank robbers passed through on their way to Wyoming, and Marshall managed to arrest them without a shot being fired. Jane had become a respected member of the community as well. She taught Sunday school at the church, helped organize charitable efforts for families in need, and was known for her skill in the kitchen. Their house was often filled with visitors, friends who stopped by for coffee and conversation. Matthew started school when he turned 6, and Rose was right behind him, demanding to go along even though she was too young. "I can learn too, Papa," she insisted with all the confidence of a 3-year-old. "You will," Marshall promised, swinging her up into his arms, "when you're bigger. For now, you get to stay home with Mama and help her." Rose pouted, but she accepted the compromise. She was too good-natured to stay upset for long. One evening in the spring of 1889, when Matthew was 8 and Rose was approaching 4, Jane told Marshall she was pregnant again. They had talked about wanting more children, hoping to give Matthew and Rose siblings to grow up with. "Third time's the charm," Jane said with a smile. "Maybe this one will look like you." "Rose looks like me," Marshall protested. "She has your eyes. That doesn't count. I want a child with your coloring, your features, so everyone can look at them and immediately know they're a Finn." This pregnancy was harder than the previous two. Jane was tired all the time, and morning sickness plagued her well into her 4th month. Doc Henderson assured them everything was progressing normally, but Marshall worried nonetheless. "I'm fine," Jane insisted one evening when Marshall was fussing over her more than usual. "Women have been having babies since the beginning of time. I've done this twice before. I know what I'm doing." "I know you do. I just worry." Jane softened and took his hand. "I know you do. But everything is fine. The baby is fine. We're all going to be fine." She was right. In November of 1889, Jane delivered a healthy baby boy they named Marcus Samuel Finn. He had Marshall's light brown hair and blue eyes, and from the moment he was born, there was no mistaking whose son he was. "There's your wish granted," Marshall said, cradling the newborn as Jane rested. "A child that looks like me." "He's perfect," Jane said sleepily. "They're all perfect." Matthew and Rose were fascinated by their new brother. Matthew, now 8, and taking his role as oldest seriously, promised to teach Marcus everything he needed to know. Rose, always dramatic, declared that Marcus was the most beautiful baby in the entire world, and she was going to take care of him forever. With 3 children under the age of 9, life became wonderfully chaotic. The house was always full of noise and laughter, with Matthew's serious questions and Rose's constant chatter, and Marcus's baby babbling. Marshall had never been happier. One evening, after all 3 children were finally asleep, Marshall and Jane collapsed onto their bed, exhausted but content. "Remember when it was just the 2 of us?" Jane asked, snuggling into Marshall's side. "Barely," Marshall admitted. "Feels like a lifetime ago." "Do you miss it, the quiet?" Marshall thought about it, then shook his head. "Not even a little bit. This is everything I ever wanted. A family, a home, you." Jane lifted her head to look at him. "Even though it's loud and messy and chaotic?" "Especially because of that." He kissed her softly. "You gave me a life I never dreamed I could have, Jane. Every single day, I thank God that I found you in that storm." "I think about that day sometimes," Jane said quietly. "How different everything could have been. If you had ridden past, if you hadn't stopped to help, Matthew and I would have died out there. But I didn't ride past, and you didn't die. We both got a second chance. The best second chance." Jane kissed him again, deeper this time. "I love you, Marshal Finn. I love the life we've built together." "I love you too, more than I can ever say." They fell asleep like that, wrapped around each other, just as they had that first night after admitting their feelings. Some things, Marshall reflected, never changed. The love between them had only grown stronger with time and challenges and children. The years continued to pass in a blur of happiness. Matthew grew into a serious young man who wanted to follow in his father's footsteps and become a lawman. Rose was vivacious and outgoing, with a talent for music that had the whole town talking about her future. Marcus was the perfect blend of his siblings, thoughtful like Matthew but joyful like Rose, with a curiosity about the world that kept his parents constantly answering questions. In 1895, when Matthew was 14, Rose was 10, and Marcus was 6. Jane surprised Marshall with the news that she was pregnant again. They had thought they were done having children, had assumed their family was complete. "Are you happy about it?" Jane asked, watching Marshall's face carefully for his reaction. Happy didn't begin to cover it. Marshall pulled Jane into his arms and spun her around, laughing. "Happy? I'm thrilled. Another child, another blessing." This pregnancy, their 4th, was the easiest yet. Jane barely had morning sickness, maintained her energy throughout, and seemed to glow with health. When she went into labor in June of 1896, it was quick and uncomplicated. Within 4 hours, they had a daughter. They named her Margaret Rose Finn, Maggie for short. She was tiny and perfect, with a head full of dark hair and a disposition that was calm and serene from day one. Where Rose had been dramatic and demanding as a baby, Maggie was content to simply observe the world around her. The older children adored their baby sister. Matthew, now 15 and towering over both his parents, was surprisingly gentle with the infant. Rose appointed herself Maggie's personal entertainer, constantly singing and making faces to elicit smiles. Marcus, who had been the baby for so long, seemed relieved to pass the title on to someone else. "Our family is complete now," Jane said one evening, when Maggie was a few weeks old. They were on the porch in their rocking chairs, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple. The 4 children were inside, Matthew helping Rose with homework, while Marcus played with blocks on the floor. "Complete," Marshall agreed. "Perfect." "Thank you," Jane said softly. "For what?" "For being the man you are, for loving me and the children, for building this life with me." She reached over and took his hand. "When you found me in that storm 12 years ago, bleeding and terrified, I never imagined this would be our future. I never imagined being this happy." Marshall squeezed her hand. "Neither did I. But here we are." "Here we are," Jane echoed. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sky darken and the stars begin to appear. Inside the house, they could hear Matthew's patient voice explaining arithmetic to Rose, could hear Marcus giggling at something, the sounds of their family, their life. Marshall thought back to that day in the storm, to finding Jane crumpled and bleeding beside the overturned wagon. He had acted on instinct, on the basic human need to help someone in distress. He had never imagined that one decision, that one moment of choosing to stop and help, would change his entire life. But it had. Jane and the children had become his whole world, the center around which everything else revolved. His job was still important. Keeping Alta safe still mattered, but at the end of every day, what he looked forward to most was coming home to this, to the noise and chaos and overwhelming love of his family. "What are you thinking about?" Jane asked. "How lucky I am," Marshall said simply. "How grateful I am for every single day I get with you and the children." Jane smiled. "We're the lucky ones. You saved us, gave us a home, gave us love. Everything good in my life started the day you carried me through that storm." "Everything good in my life started then too," Marshall replied. "I just didn't know it yet." They rocked slowly, hands clasped as night fell over Alta. Inside, Maggie started crying, and they could hear Matthew picking her up, soothing her with gentle words. Rose was singing now, some silly song she had made up. Marcus was asking questions about why stars twinkled. This was their life. Loud, messy, chaotic, absolutely perfect. Marshall wouldn't change a single thing. The years that followed continued in much the same way, filled with the daily joys and challenges of raising 4 children. Matthew graduated from school and began training with Marshall, learning what it took to be a lawman. He was patient and thorough, with a natural sense of justice that made Marshall proud. Rose developed into a talented musician, playing piano at church services and local gatherings. She had inherited Jane's beauty and warmth, and by the time she was 16, half the young men in Alta were courting her. She turned them all down politely, insisting she was too young to think about marriage. Marcus showed an aptitude for learning that impressed everyone. He read constantly, asking questions about everything from astronomy to zoology. Doc Henderson took him under his wing, teaching him about medicine and the human body. Marshall suspected his younger son might become a doctor someday. Maggie grew into a quiet, thoughtful child who loved animals and the outdoors. She could often be found in the stable with the horses or in the fields beyond town, watching birds and collecting wildflowers. She had a gentleness about her that drew both people and animals to her. In the summer of 1900, when Matthew was 19 and courting a sweet girl named Emma Wright, Jane and Marshall celebrated their 15th wedding anniversary. Technically, they had been married 16 years, but they counted from the day they admitted they loved each other, not the day of the practical wedding arrangement. The children had planned a surprise party, inviting friends and neighbors to the house for a celebration. Marshall and Jane arrived home from a rare afternoon away to find their yard full of people, tables laden with food, and a banner strung across the porch declaring, "Happy Anniversary!" "Did you know about this?" Jane asked Marshall as they stood surveying the scene. "Not a clue. Our children are sneaky." Matthew appeared, grinning widely. "Surprise! We wanted to do something special for you both. You're always taking care of everyone else. Tonight, we take care of you." The party was wonderful, full of laughter and good food and heartfelt toasts. Dr. Henderson, now quite elderly but still practicing medicine, gave a speech about how proud he was to have witnessed Marshall and Jane's love story from the beginning. "I remember the day Marshall brought Jane to my office," the old doctor said. "She was hurt and scared, and that baby she was carrying was in danger. But even then, I could see something special between them, the way Marshall looked at her, the way Jane trusted him completely. I knew they were meant for each other, even if they didn't know it yet." People cheered and clinked glasses. Marshall pulled Jane close, kissing her despite the crowd watching. "Let them see," he thought. "Let them all see how much I love this woman." Later, after the guests had gone home and the children had gone to bed, Marshall and Jane sat on their porch swing, enjoying the quiet. 15 years, Jane mused. Sometimes it feels like yesterday. Sometimes it feels like forever. "Forever in the best way," Marshall clarified. "Yes, in the best way." Jane rested her head on his shoulder. "We've built a good life, haven't we?" "The best life. Matthew is getting married next spring. Emma is a lovely girl." "She is. She'll make him happy." "Rose will probably be next. I've seen the way David Foster looks at her." Marshall groaned. "She's only 17, too young to be thinking about marriage." Jane laughed. "I was younger than that when I married James." "These things happen, Marshall. Our children are growing up." "I know. I just wish they could stay young a little longer." "Me too. But that's not how life works." Jane lifted her head to look at him. "We still have Marcus and Maggie at home. They're not going anywhere for a while yet." "Thank goodness for that." They sat in comfortable silence, swaying gently on the swing. The night was warm and clear, stars scattered across the sky like diamonds on black velvet. In the distance, an owl hooted, and somewhere nearby, a coyote howled. "Do you ever think about that day?" Jane asked quietly. "The day you found me?" "All the time," Marshall admitted. "It was the most important day of my life." "Mine too. Everything changed that day. My whole future shifted in a heartbeat." "Do you have any regrets?" Marshall asked. It was a question he had never dared voice before. "About staying in Alta? About marrying me? About any of it?" Jane turned to face him fully, her expression serious. "Marshal Finn, I have never regretted a single moment of our life together. You gave me and Matthew a home when we had nothing. You loved us when we were broken and scared. You've been the most wonderful husband and father I could ever imagine. How could I possibly regret any of that?" Relief flooded through Marshall. He knew Jane loved him, had never doubted it. But hearing her say it, hearing the certainty in her voice, meant everything. "I love you," he said simply. "Today, tomorrow, always." "Always," Jane echoed, kissing him softly. "For the rest of our lives and beyond." The years continued their steady march forward. Matthew married Emma in a beautiful spring wedding, and within a year they had given Marshall and Jane their first grandchild, a boy they named Thomas. Rose did indeed marry David Foster when she turned 18, and they settled on a ranch just outside of town. Marcus went off to medical school in Salt Lake City, determined to become a doctor like his mentor, Doc Henderson. Maggie, their youngest, stayed close to home, eventually marrying a kind young man named Peter Stevens who worked at the bank. As Marshall entered his 50s, he began thinking about retirement. His deputy, a capable young man named Jack Turner, was ready to take over as sheriff. Alta had grown considerably over the years, now boasting a population of nearly 2,000, and Marshall felt confident leaving the town in Jack's hands. On his 53rd birthday, Marshall officially retired from law enforcement. The town threw him a party, presenting him with a gold watch and countless testimonials about his years of service. Marshall was touched by the outpouring of affection, but what he looked forward to most was having more time with Jane and their growing family. Retirement suited him. He spent his days helping with the grandchildren, working in the garden, and taking long walks with Jane through the mountains they both loved. They traveled occasionally, visiting Marcus in Salt Lake City, or going to see Rose and David at their ranch, but mostly they were content to stay in Alta, in the house where they had raised their children, surrounded by memories and love. One evening in the autumn of 1910, Marshall and Jane were sitting on their porch as the sun set. It had become their evening ritual over the years, this quiet time together watching the day end. They were both in their 60s now, their hair gray and their bodies showing the wear of hard lives well lived. But they were healthy and happy, blessed with children and grandchildren who visited often. "Do you remember what you told me once?" Jane asked. "About your father saying the measure of a man is in what he does when someone needs help?" I remember. You lived that lesson every day of your life, Marshall. You've helped so many people over the years, including me. Marshall took her hand, noting how well it still fit in his, despite the decades that had passed. You helped me too, you know. You gave me purpose, gave me a family, gave me a reason to come home every night. We helped each other, Jane said. That's what love is, isn't it? Two people helping each other through life. I think you're right. They sat quietly, watching as the sky turned from gold to pink to deep purple. Inside the house, they could hear Maggie's children playing, their laughter bright and joyful. Thomas was visiting with his wife and their new baby. Rose had stopped by earlier with fresh bread from her kitchen. We did good, didn't we? Jane asked. With our life? With our children? We did better than good, Marshall said firmly. We built something beautiful, something lasting. Jane leaned against him, and Marshall wrapped his arm around her shoulders. They fit together perfectly, even after all these years. Two people who had found each other in the worst circumstances imaginable and built the best life possible. I love you, Jane whispered. I love you too, Marshall replied. Always have, always will. The stars began to appear overhead, one by one, until the sky was full of them. Marshall and Jane stayed on the porch long into the night, holding each other, remembering their past and grateful for their present. They had been through so much together, survived storms both literal and metaphorical, and through it all, their love had remained constant, unchanging, eternal. That was the real miracle, Marshall thought. Not that he had saved Jane's life all those years ago in the storm. The miracle was that she had saved his in return, had given him a reason to live rather than just exist. Together, they had created a family, a legacy, a love story that would outlast them both. As the night deepened and the air grew cool, Marshall and Jane finally went inside, hand in hand, to the home they had built together. Behind them, the mountains stood eternal under the stars, watching over Alta and its people just as they always had. And in that small house on the edge of town, two people who had found each other against all odds prepared for bed, secure in the knowledge that whatever tomorrow brought, they would face it together, just as they always had, just as they always would.